Welcome to the Whistleblower Newsroom. I'm Christina Borgeson. Here are some statistics for you. Over the last 4 decades, the wealthiest 1% of all Americans gained $21 trillion in wealth. Over the same period, American households in the bottom half have seen their fortunes diminish by $900 billion. Since 1978, corporate executive compensation has exploded by 900%, while the typical American's wages have risen by less than 12%. The 10 richest people in the world are collectively worth more than the economies of the poorest 85 countries. How did this happen? My guest today offers a 2-word explanation: Davos Man. Davos Man is also the title of author and financial investigative journalist Peter Goodman's bombshell book. The statistics I quoted are from his book, the subtitle for which is, quote, "How the Billionaires Devoured the World," unquote, an apt description of the book's contents. Goodman, the global economics correspondent for the New York Times, has captured the activities of Davos Man and his supporting cast of government leaders, lobbyists, and many others who continue to create ever more dire circumstances for many on the planet. His book provides a vivid account of Davos Man's global wielding of power on a surreal level, made even more surreal because it is wielded under the guise of what Goodman describes as, quote, Davos Man's cosmic lie, unquote. Goodman's here today to talk about all that. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks so much for having me.
What is the definition of Davos Man?
Davos Man is this term that was coined by the political scientist Samuel Huntington back in 2004, and he used it to refer to people who attend the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. That's this annual gathering in the Swiss Alps of the most powerful people on earth, billionaires, heads of state, along with the odd Hollywood celebrity, public intellectuals. I'm using it to refer to not only the billionaire class, but this unique set of the billionaire class that would have us believe that they are actually the solution to our problems, that we need not worry about progressive taxation. We don't have to worry about antitrust enforcement. We don't have to worry about labor being able to bargain collectively for wages. We can just entrust our fate to the goodness of the billionaire class because their interests are the same as ours. And of course, at the World Economic Forum, they convene under this mantra, committed to improving the state of the world, which kind of gives away the absurdity of the enterprise. These are the people who are the ultimate beneficiaries of the status quo.
Now, you've actually been to Davos quite a bit.
Yeah, I've been there, I think, 9 times.
Just talk about the scene there. You called it, in your book, I think you called it the biggest lobbying or the most powerful lobbying
I quote
organization.
A former forum official who said, no, this is essentially where the most powerful people meet in secret to write the rules for the rest of us. Look, the forum, it's sort of front-facing part is just an earnest gathering of people talking about important subjects of the day. They have this agenda. It's a bunch of seminars and conferences, people meeting in this Congress Center in the center of the village of Davos. And, they're there to discuss climate change and the future of work and nuclear proliferation, racial and gender injustice, all the subjects that you would expect an earnest institution that's trying to improve the state of the world would discuss. But the cool kids at Davos, the people who actually pay the bills, the companies that spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for membership, they will actually tell you with pride that, oh, I never set foot inside the conference center. Maybe they go for the simulation of the Syrian refugee experience. This is a real example. I'm not making this up. I've seen billionaires submit to being blindfolded and led around in the dark while people are screaming at them to present their papers in languages they don't understand. And then they all congratulate one another for their empathy. And then they go back to what for them is the real Davos, like a banquet held off outside of the Congress Center by some global bank or consulting firm where they have truffles and caviar and champagne. Or maybe they go back to the Congress Center just to get access to the exclusive lounges where no journalists are allowed, not even the ones accredited to cover the forum as participants. There's no regulators. There's no annoying do-gooders. They can just do their business. And this is where the founder of the forum, a guy named Klaus Schwab, will play matchmaker. He will set up the CEO of a fossil fuel company with heads of monarchies from Persian Gulf states that control access to fossil fuels. This is where a lot of deal making gets done beyond the normal regulatory purview.
All of Davos feels like a cover for that, in a sense.
I mean, it's all of the above, right? So what I argue in the book and what I've come to see over the years is that Davos Man's great skill, this species of human separate from the rest of us, is that he's able to kind of craft a narrative that's very self-serving. Like, tax cuts are great for everyone. Deregulation is great for everyone. Clearly great for him, not so great for everyone else, while actually believing the merits of the pitch. And Klaus Schwab, who's a key character in my book, the founder of the forum, I think probably founded the forum for fairly idealistic reasons. Believed in the idea. He was an economist from Germany who had studied management in the States, believed that if you combined the vibrance of the private sector with the importance of the public sector, you could solve problems. And he first convened the forum in the early 70s, just a few hundred people atop the mountains in the Swiss Alps, talking about the problems of the day. Now, as it grew and his ambitions grew, it became more and more of a business. I mean, his marketing genius was understanding that the world was full of seminars where rich people could go and talk about how to get more rich. Forbes and Fortune had that locked up. But by touting this as operating under the banner committed to improving the state of the world, you could signal your virtue and then go and do real business. And so the two aspirations have grown in tandem. I mean, Schwab will tell people privately that he looks forward to one day receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. He really views himself as this important diplomat who could bring together Xi Jinping, the president of China, with the heads of state from the United States and Britain and India. They can discuss, how we're going to deal with climate change. But along the way, again and again, he makes the compromises that ensure that the powerful people show up, which is why the other powerful people show up. I mean, it's a kind of digital stone soup.
Along the way, too, he started business enterprises that have made him quite wealthy, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, the forum is on paper a nonprofit. And Schwab, I tell the story in the book, at one point dispatched his nephew to Boston. This is back in the late 90s when he's hanging around with people like Jeff Bezos. He's the main draw at the forum in those days. Schwab clearly wants some of that money. He sends his nephew off to Boston to go run this video conferencing program, sort of like, a distant beginnings of Zoom. And the nephew builds up the technology, he builds partnerships, and eventually he flips this company to a listed company in the States, US WebCore, and turns a $5 million investment. This is from the forum itself. I mean, the nonprofit foundation of the forum turns it into about 20 million. And at the last minute, when the deal's about to go through, Klaus Schwab calls his nephew and says, listen, one change, we need the proceeds of the deal to go not into the forum, but into this new foundation, the Klaus and Hilda Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. Now, they will tell you, they issue these reports, this money's gone to drill wells for clean water in Africa and to promote education for girls in Pakistan. But it's operating under Swiss law. It's a black box. There's no way to know where the money went. And the nephew told me, my uncle had seen all this money and he wanted a piece himself. And it was clear that he wanted this money to flow into his control. We also know, I mean, this is research I did for my book, that the foundation has spent somewhere around $70 million in recent years to buy land that ties together Schwab's personal home in the Coligny section of Geneva. This is like the Beverly Hills of Geneva, with the forum headquarters, which is this grandiose glass-fronted building on Lake Geneva. So for Schwab, business and personal really mix. I mean, most nights he has a banquet at his house where he's entertaining potentially heads of state, CEOs of multinational companies. The bill's picked up by the forum. He's flying around first class around the world, all picked up by the forum. He's driving Audi cars that are given to him at steep discounts. Audi is a leading sponsor of the forum, and so it goes.
The thing that really struck me was how you delineated how Davos Man, he tries to project himself as a good human being with, and he has come up with this term stakeholder capitalism, which I'd like you to talk about.
Sure.
But he is also the purveyor of what you call the cosmic lie. So I know that I'm bundling two things together, but they're sort of linked.
They go together.
Right. And the other thing in that whole package, when you answer, I'd like you to also talk about what capitalism used to be and what the Davos Man capitalism is, as you defined in your book.
First of all, the cosmic lie is a combination of trickle-down economics and deregulation. It's this idea that if we organize our societies around diverting more and more wealth to the people who already have most of it, the benefits will ripple out to everyone, will trickle down, whatever your water metaphor.
Trickle down economics. That was Milton Friedman. Greed is good.
That was Ronald Reagan.
Yeah,
more money in the pockets of people who have it, and they'll spend it, and we'll all benefit, which is something that has in reality happened 0 times. But we keep trying it because the first part of it always works out. If you cut taxes and you deregulate, wealthy people really do end up with a lot more money. It just turns out they don't invest it. They don't go and spend it productively. They tend to put it in their pocket. They stash it away overseas, beyond reach of the tax collector. They entrust it to their children through their estates when they are no longer. They buy back shares of their companies, which is good for shareholders, but not so good for workers. They don't do any of the things that they promise, and yet they employ friendly think tank researchers. They endow university chairs. They unleash legions of lobbyists to pervade this idea that has really insinuated itself into our political discourse. Now you ask about stakeholder capitalism in connection with Davos Man. So, I argue that Davos Man is a species that we have to understand as a species per se, because he's really a predator, but his way of attacking is by adopting the stance of our friend and winning our trust and convincing us to let our defenses down while he's ripping our faces off. And you can see this, most sharply in what's come of stakeholder capitalism. This is this idea that Klaus Schwab started discussing back in the 70s, but it's really gained currency in recent years when back in the summer of 2019, the Business Roundtable, which is this lobbying group that's comprised of large CEOs of major corporations, then headed by another one of my primary characters, Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, America's largest bank. The Business Roundtable declared officially the age of Milton Friedmanism is over. The idea that greed is good, that if you just run your company to try to reward shareholders as much as possible, that's gone. Now we're in the age of stakeholder capitalism, where you're catering to a whole range of stakeholders like labor, never labor unions. You don't hear that term thrown around, but labor, local communities, the environment. Mark Benioff, who's another one of my primary characters, who's the CEO of Salesforce and a big champion of stakeholder capitalism, once said, the planet is a stakeholder, which is, really reassuring to those of us who live on the planet. This is a PR term. And the first big test of stakeholder capitalism, this idea that companies are now run for the benefit of all of us, for society. It's not just about the bottom line. The great test of this came with the pandemic itself. And let's look at, who signed this new statement of a purpose of a corporation organized by the Business Roundtable. There were 180 plus CEOs who signed. One of them was Jeff Bezos. who we know allowed his warehouse workers to continue to labor without protection, without face masks and gowns and even hand sanitizer in the first wave of the pandemic, even as they got sick, while the white collar managers were working at the safe remove of Zoom from their homes. We know that he said that his workers were essential workers who were heroically saving other people's grandparents from the pandemic. We also know that the workers themselves could see that they were putting into boxes the same things that were denied them to paying customers. They were shipping out hand sanitizer and masks and gowns and such. And that when the workers protested, most famously at a warehouse in Staten Island, New York, where a guy whose story I tell in the book, Christian Smalls, he organizes a walkout, and he's fired for violating quarantine. Which is really bitterly ironic, given that he wants everyone to be quarantined, though with paid sick leave, so they don't have to choose between paying the rent, keeping the lights on, and feeding their children, and putting their lives on the line to go work in a warehouse without protection. He is fired, and then Amazon releases these television spots with interviews with happy Amazon workers, attesting to all of the things the company's done to look out for them. And these spots are disseminated as real local TV spots. They're actually aired by scores of TV stations across the United States. And Bezos then, in the middle of the pandemic, blasts himself into space for $5.5 billion, and then has the audacity on landing to thank his workers. I mean, we have to look at this as, it's not just that Bezos, who at one point was worth $200 billion, is prospering while his warehouse workers are not doing so well. It's that Bezos is prospering because his warehouse workers are not doing so well. And yet this is a company that officially is organized along the lines of stakeholder capitalism. Another great champion of stakeholder capitalism is another key character in my book, Larry Fink. He's the founder of BlackRock. This is the world's largest asset management company. This is a company that manages upwards of $10 trillion. You heard that right. That's $10 trillion. That's university endowments, that's pension funds. And Fink is a guy who would tell you that, any company that doesn't get right with climate change or doing right by society on race or gender, they will have the markets discipline them. The markets will deprive them of capital and they will fail. Well, at the same time, Fink is organizing a $15 billion investment into Saudi Aramco. This is the Saudi state-owned energy giant that's expanding its fossil fuel holdings, that it only recently murdered the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Fink is delivering investment to JBS. This is a giant Brazilian beef conglomerate that's clear-cutting the Amazon to expand its cattle operations. And Fink personally, I tell this story in some detail in the book, turns the screws to Argentina in the midst of the pandemic to try to collect on the bonds that he credulously purchased while buying into the idea that a former president, Mauricio Macri, was this great change agent for Argentina. When Argentina lands in arrears, this is really bad for Fink because, in years past, emerging market debt crises usually just involved a bunch of bankers. Citigroup would meet with Bank of America in a room and they would say, whoops, things went bad. How much are we going to write off? Fink is now on the hook for, the savings of school teachers in Omaha and firefighters in the north of England. And it's very unpalatable that he's going to have to go to them and say, sorry, I lost half your money on Argentine debt. Sorry about that. So he personally turns the screws to the Argentine government, then contending with rising poverty, extreme demands on its healthcare system, and manages to extract an extra few cents on the dollar in a debt settlement that was very clearly designed to convey the message to other developing countries around the globe that nobody stiffs Davos man. And this is what will happen to you. And as a result of that, we have healthcare systems from Pakistan to Ghana, again, in the midst of a pandemic, actually cutting what they're spending on public health, cutting what they're spending on social services for the most vulnerable people so that they can prioritize debt payments to the likes of Larry Fink and other creditors in London, in Beijing, in Frankfurt. This is another champion of stakeholder capitalism.
Talk about Blackstone, about their influence here in the United States in real estate and in health.
Blackstone is headed by Steve Schwarzman, who's another major figure in my book. He's a private equity magnate who's worth, depending upon the day, $35 billion. Once likened proposals to increase taxes on wealthy people, like Hitler invading Poland. I mean, this is someone who has real disregard for ordinary people and people who depend upon the government. So he has a tremendous ability to gravitate where there's money to be made. I mean, whatever you want to say about Steve Schwarzman, he's a very savvy investor. And after the great financial crisis and the Great Depression, when tens of millions of Americans were losing their homes, Schwarzman plowed in and bought up homes, by the million, and flipped them for hundreds of millions of dollars in profit, made billions of dollars for a whole bunch of Wall Street entities that sell the bonds. And classic Davos man, he's not content to simply make all this money and deliver to his shareholders. He would have us think that this was an act of civic virtue. I mean, you can see him in speeches, in his own memoir. He talks about how this had nothing to do with the money. He went into neighborhoods that were in great distress, and we had abandoned homes and weeds overgrowing, and the properties and rodents running around. Such an eyesore. And he slapped on fresh coats of paint and cut the lawns and got carpenters back to work and fixed up communities. And you can almost hear the soundtrack for a comforting life insurance commercial with an adorable golden retriever puppy romping with a toddler on a lawn. The reality is he creates the subsidiary called Invitation Homes, which is an invitation for vulnerable people to pay much higher rent. He invites them to sit on hold for hours trying to reach someone if they have a problem, if there's a plumbing issue, if there's an electrical issue, if there's a problem with a payment. And he understands that people are vulnerable. And this is a pattern that we see with Schwarzman. We saw it again in his very savvy investments in healthcare in the run-up to the pandemic. He buys he spent $6 billion in 2016 to buy a company called Team Health. This is an emergency room staffing company that is responsible for huge numbers of medical professionals working in emergency rooms. And again, not an accident that it's the emergency room, just as he understands that low-income housing is a good place to be because people can't leave easily. And just as any casino magnate will tell you that it's a great thing to make your money in a darkened room where people don't know what time it is and they're drinking and taking leave of their senses, any savvy investor understands that the emergency room is a special place because the customer, as it were, may be wheeled in on a gurney. They're not really in the mood to ask about the particulars of their health insurance policies or the bill. They're going to sign on the dotted line so they can go see the people with the white coats back there. And Schwarzman's company, Team Health, has been at the center of this so-called surprise billing scandal. The surprise is not of the happy variety. This is a situation where people go to emergency rooms thinking that they are safely within their health insurance network, not realizing that they are signing away their rights to be treated in network. And then weeks or months later, they get these incredible bills. They get hassled by debt collectors, and this is part of the financialization of our healthcare industry. Schwarzman is at the bleeding edge of turning healthcare into an industry that functions not all that differently from your local Starbucks, whatever airline you're flying on, fast food chains. The people coming in the door are customers. The people who deal with them should be maximizing revenue, and those people are costs to be minimized. And most importantly, just like your airline wants every seat to be full on the plane, if you own healthcare, you'd like all the facilities to be crammed full. Anything else is a waste. And this is part of why, it's a major part of why, in the several decades before the pandemic, the US loses roughly a third of its hospital rooms. This is why the wealthiest country on earth given a several month head start, able to see what's happening in China, able to see how Taiwan and South Korea are responding to the pandemic, able to see what disaster befalls places like Italy, still is completely overwhelmed by the pandemic. And I detail the story in the book of an emergency room doctor who works for Blackstone's company, Team Health. This is a guy named Ming Lin. He's a decorated ER doc who had worked in New York near the World Trade Center during 9/11. And he's out at a hospital in Bellingham, Washington. And he asks in March 2020, with the state of Washington already in a state of emergency, the governor declared, why do we have people just coming in the door normally with no triage system, no social distancing? Why don't the people at reception have masks on? Why is it that people who bring their own masks are told not to? And he's told by his supervisors at this Blackstone-owned company, hey, listen, we work for the hospital. The hospital is our client. And the hospital doesn't want to freak out the patients with people wearing masks. Then he says, as this goes on, well, why are we still doing elective surgeries? I mean, shouldn't we be in, all hands on deck for the pandemic? And he's told, well, elective surgeries are the bread and butter. He gets so disgusted and concerned that he goes on Facebook. I mean, at that point, he had never taken up a political cause. His Facebook feed was filled with pictures of himself and his children, his wife playing the violin. He goes on Facebook as a whistleblower and says he's very concerned about what's happening at the hospital. And the hospital reprimands him and eventually fires him. This is a whistleblower who was trying to say that the intersection of private equity and healthcare was making us vulnerable to a pandemic that we now know has killed hundreds of thousands of people in the United States alone. And he was fired as a threat to the bottom line.
I want to talk about the 2008 crash because
Sure.
That's a classic Davos man created crisis. And then, frankly, you have Obama and his administration handmaidening their not just soft, but profitable landing after that.
The 2008 financial crisis was a place where we can see who matters when things go awry in America. And who matters? Asset holders. I mean, this is a variant of the cosmic lie, right? We don't rescue homeowners. We're told by Obama's Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, who has gone off to work in finance and has always been very friendly with finance, that would be, what he calls a moral hazard. We can't bail people out who tapped the equity in their homes to finance trips to Tahiti and extravagant bathrooms that they really didn't need. That would just reward them for their sins. So we've got to take a hard line with homeowners, but we got to bail out the people who actually delivered the crisis, the banks that gambled recklessly on mortgages. And so the result of this is enduring bitterness and unfairness. So, first of all, let's pause and realize that, yes, of course, there were plenty of people who used the equity in their homes for all sorts of foolish things. But there were more people who had to avail themselves of whatever credit they could, because the financiers like Jamie Dimon and Steve Schwartzman were gambling on housing. Housing had become, and the mortgage industry itself had become, just sort of raw material in this speculator's casino. And that had driven up housing prices for everyone. So if you were unlucky enough to have children who came of school age in 2005 in a place like Miami or San Diego, or really anywhere in America, you didn't have a say over what it cost to put your family in a decent school district. You had to pay whatever the real estate price was, and society was telling you, it was your imperative to put your kids in a good school district. So you paid, and finance made the credit available, and then the whole thing came down. And when that happened, the homeowners got nothing. They lost their homes. They tarnished their credit for years. And meanwhile, people like Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan Chase, used the crisis as a chance to roll up lots of failed competing banks. So he amassed greater market share than ever. His stock value eventually soared. as the assets that he was controlling grew. His own compensation grew dramatically. And
even though he helped engineer the crash with his irresponsible oversight of...
There's dispute about that because JP Morgan Chase doesn't end up looking like the worst of that bunch, but it certainly helps itself to the wreckage.
We have Paulson, who helps him snap up Bear Stearns.
Jamie Dimon will say, well, I was just doing what the government asked me to do to mount these rescues, but he gets these incredible subsidies from the Fed, and it's a net winner for him. And moreover, if the government doesn't bail out all these asset holders, JP Morgan Chase itself is in real danger because, all the companies that do business with JP Morgan Chase are going to go down in that scenario. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the government shouldn't have rescued finance. I mean, that is a view that's out there. It's not necessarily my view. I mean, I accept that at that moment in time, these institutions actually were too big to fail. And that if we had allowed them to fail, the consequences would have been really dire for regular people along with executives who probably would have figured out how to be okay even in that scenario. But the point is, we have this split screen reality where the CEOs get bailed out. There's no prosecution. So there are no consequences for the really bad actors who engage in wholesale mortgage fraud. And the ordinary person can see that their needs don't seem to matter very much to the elite, to the federal government, to the people who actually control the economy, but the needs of the asset holders do. And this kind of bitterness is toxic in a democratic society, and it lays the ground for political opportunists, like eventually Donald Trump, to come along and tell very misleading stories, demonize, the wrong people, and divert our attention from the accountability for Davos Man. I mean, what I argued fundamentally in my book, and it's around the great financial crisis, not just in the States, but also in the UK and in other economies in Europe, is that from that period, we get this deepening cynicism that opens the door to a whole bunch of political movements that demonize immigrants. Or, Trump comes along and demonizes not only Central American and Mexican immigrants, but China. And of course, China is a complex threat to the global trading system. There are reasons we ought to be concerned about China's impact on American living standards. But let's face it, like American middle-class households have not declined because of decisions made in Beijing or immigrants streaming over the border. American living standards have been pillaged by Davos Man. I mean, by decisions made in boardrooms in Seattle and New York and in the halls of Congress. America is a beneficiary of global capitalism, but we have not distributed the goods in a just way. And that's not by accident. That's because the people whose stories I'm telling in this book and a broader group of Davos men have used their winnings to purchase the levers of our democracy. They have poisoned our discourse with faith in things like the cosmic lie. They have unleashed legions of lobbyists and accountants to find tax loopholes, to write new ones. And so the result of that is the ultimate story I tell in this book, which is this bottom-up transfer of wealth. And to your point, the great financial crisis of 2008 was a landmark in this, but it was pretty far down the track. It's a story that begins in the 80s. It's a systematic transfer of wealth from the bottom up. And that story will play out all sorts of different ways. We can't always predict how it will play out, but we certainly know that when you leave tens of millions of people having good reason to conclude that the system doesn't care about them, they're going to be ripe for the picking by political opportunists, conspiracy theories. You can draw a direct line between this kind of inequality and the January 6th insurrection.
When you say they don't believe, I mean, the system really does not care about them, because let's face it, I just wonder, first of all, those are tax dollars paid by those people who foreclosed on their homes that are being given to the banks.
That's right.
Okay?
Yeah, that's
They're tax dollars. So when the president or his Treasury Secretary says, morally, it wouldn't be a good thing to give you back a few of your tax dollars so that you wouldn't foreclose on your home. We need to give that to these big banks, because if that system fails, I don't know, the world comes to an end. So I just wonder, like, how much exactly would it have cost to bail out those foreclosed people? Do you think it came to anything near what was given to the banks to bail them out?
No, it would have cost a couple $100 million. But
so why couldn't that have been done? But my point is exactly that. Obama allowed that principle. Obama and his Treasury Secretary presented that principle to the American people when they're handling their own money that they gave to the government, supposedly representing them. Okay?
Right.
That is why people are pissed off.
Yeah, you're right.
It's not even about the objects. It's about exactly what happened. I mean,
that's right.
Obama stuffed his his administration with a bunch of Citigroup people, didn't he? I mean, there was a list of people. I mean, they actually sent him. Didn't they send him a list of people for various cabinet positions?
He had Larry Summers, who had come out of Bob Rubin's Treasury. Rubin, of course, goes off to run Citigroup. Yeah, I mean, he had a lot of finance people.
He had a lot of finance people.
New York Fed and was tight with Wall Street people. And Geithner, at that time, would very clearly shut down discussion of any people considered for posts at the Fed or Treasury if they were deemed anti-Wall Street. I mean, if you, in other words, if you didn't buy into the cosmic lie that at the center of our economy should be the needs of wealthy people, you were not fit for service in the Obama administration.
Who repealed Glass-Steagall? Was it Clinton?
Yeah, that was Clinton.
Clinton paved the way, right,
sure,
for this crash. He paved the way. And Clinton has been Mr. Davos Man handmaiden throughout.
Clinton certainly did the bidding of Wall Street. Clinton, I think if you're going to talk about Clinton, you have to talk about the decision not to regulate derivatives, which were elite. I mean, that's what turned a bunch of mortgages into instruments so huge that they were big enough to wreck the financial system. It wasn't just that all these people had taken out more money than they could afford. It's that Wall Street built these cosmically large bets synthetically out of mortgages posited against other pools of mortgages, just this massive leverage through the system. And back in this is a story I told long ago. I mean, back in the late 90s, a woman who was running the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, a woman named Brooksley Bourne, proposed that there be rules on derivatives where there had to be a regulator, there had to be transparent marketplaces, there had to be funds set aside in reserve against some of these bets going bad. And actually, Larry Summers and Bob Rubin, who was then the Treasury Secretary, Summers was then the deputy, and Alan Greenspan, the famous Fed chair, essentially beat her up and convinced the Clinton administration that such a move would jeopardize the American financial industry. All this money would flow to places like London and Hong Kong. And so business went on as usual. And you can certainly draw a direct line. I mean, you can see the magnitude of trading in derivatives gets bigger and bigger as a result of that decision. Clinton also opened up some key tax loopholes. I mean, it was Clinton's Treasury, and honestly, I can't remember if it was Rubin or Summers who was there then, who allowed companies to get out of their American tax bills by booking their revenue in foreign jurisdictions. So, this is
like Ireland. Yeah.
Yeah, like Ireland, like your tech company, and suddenly on paper, oh, actually, we're not based in America anymore. We're headquartered in Ireland, and that's where our intellectual property lives. And all this money we're making selling to companies in the United States, well, actually, we have to pay this enormous licensing fee for our intellectual property. We have to pay that money to our subsidiary in Ireland. So they're actually the ones making all the money. We're actually making losses in America. So we're going to pay taxes in Ireland where the rates might be as low as 7-8% on corporate taxes. Meanwhile, we're going to pay 0 in the United States. Well, that was a gift from the Clinton Treasury to business. And the result of that is a systematic transfer of wealth from all of us to a handful of billionaires who can hire the lobbyists to make such things happen.
Back to Obama. So, okay, I understand that the institutions themselves are too big to fail, okay? But I don't understand why those executives who made those decisions, who had spent all those years lobbying, lobbying for a situation that stole money from everybody, literally, on the planet, why they're too big to jail. That I don't get.
If you want to get into that, you should go talk to my friend Jesse Eisinger, who wrote this wonderful book called The Chicken Shit Club, which essentially argues, this is beyond the purview of my book. Essentially argues that the SEC and other federal regulatory agencies and prosecutors have just gotten really kind of flabby. They engage in settlements. They're afraid to lose, so they don't marshal cases. And his argument is that you have to be willing to lose in order to win, and the social imperatives to prosecute the people who actually delivered this fraud that wrecked our real economy are so great that you've got to go after some of them.
Flabby is not the way I describe it. I would actually describe it as corrupt. They have their people inside the SEC. I mean, I've spoken to some former people who have worked for the SEC, and boy, when you go up against these big boys, they come after you, and they're not, these are people who are willing to do things legal and illegal, extreme things, to maintain the status quo.
These are people, no doubt, who have quite an apparatus to maintain the status quo. And in the case of prosecutors, there's the revolving door. Lots of prosecutors know that eventually they're going to cash in and go to work for the people they're supposed to be regulating and prosecuting. So they play nice and they favor settlements, and everybody can be reasonable. And then they can go off and earn, 5 times as much working inside the corporate offices and the places they're supposed to be watching. And again, the net effect of that is a loss of faith in the elites that is well earned.
Loss of faith. I would call it outright hostility at this point. I think people are starting to wake up to what's happening. I think the bank bailouts was a big eye-opener for people.
I would push back on, I think some people are starting to wake up to that. But when you look at the fact that so much of the anger in our societies is directed not at the people who are responsible, but at the most vulnerable people, it's hard to accept that as a conclusion. I mean, how do we end up spending all of our time talking about, supposed Central American gang members terrorizing communities in the Midwest, where nobody's actually seen any such people, instead of talking about the bankers and hedge funders? And
the U.S. press has a lot to do with that, I think. But I'm really super interested in the fact that what you were saying about Trump being a result of all the Davos Man activities, and he comes in. Of course, he portrayed himself, he portrayed himself as a man of the people, and he was gonna go after China and this and that, and actually, behind all that, behind that veil, tell people what he did.
Well, he's a reality television star, right? This is a guy who's basically failed at everything he's ever undertaken, except for his time as a reality television star. His businesses have all gone bankrupt. He has to inflate his own income in order to justify more lending. Fewer and fewer entities will even do business with him. So Trump comes in. He keenly understands that he's riding a wave of populist outrage, and he looks for photo ops to demonstrate his commitment to the cause. So, I read about steel workers at a plant in Illinois they're just furious with China. That's an industry where it's true that they do face unfair competition from China, and people can argue that their livelihoods are being damaged by unfair competition from China. And Trump comes in and slaps tariffs on all steel, even from allies, as if the Canadians, the Germans, the Brits, they're menacing us with steel. There are going to be 25%, across the board tariffs on all imported steel. And he goes out to the Granite City, Illinois plant, where I spent some time in my book, and he mugs for the cameras with the delighted steelworkers with hard hats on, and everyone celebrates this moment. Well, few people note that there's 6 times as many people in the United States who go to work at factories that buy steel as there are people who go to plants that make steel. So the net effect of this is to damage the competitiveness of American companies. And I spent time actually in Trump country in Western Michigan, in the town of Holland, where I talked to a company that was making circuit boards for electronics companies. And they were openly talking about, if this continues, we're going to have to shut our doors and move to Mexico, something that we find just appalling. But if we can't buy steel at competitive prices in our own country, we're going to have to go somewhere else. But that, Trump understands is like a footnote in a Commerce Department report, whereas, the picture of him hanging out with steelworkers in Granite City who are patting him on the back, well, that's a shot that could lead the nightly news. So he delivers. Meanwhile, he's bankrolled by the likes of Steve Schwarzman, who gets Trump to deliver. These guys, by the way, they both own mansions close together. Trump's Mar-a-Lago sits very close to one of Schwarzman's many residences. I say, as I note in the book, he owns residences the way most of us own socks. Well, one of his places is in Mar-a-Lago. They dine together. Schwarzman lets him know that one of his great dreams is to get access to individual retirement accounts, 401ks, not just pension funds. And the literature shows that companies like Blackstone operating so-called alternative assets like private equity funds, the track record is poor. Most investors will do much better just taking their money and sticking it in some plain vanilla index fund, like an S&P 500 index fund. These specialty funds don't perform better. They usually perform worse. There are huge fees involved, but this is the great frontier for Schwarzman. And sure enough, Trump delivers, and through an order that hardly anyone notices, except for the trade press, which writes it up, Davos Man style, as like a boon for consumer choice. He opens up the great frontier of individual retirement to companies like Blackstone.
There's the pixie dust, boon for individual choice, and then, of course, invest in this risky thing that you're probably going to lose your life savings on, or you could very possibly lose. It's just, or at least
so you won't do as well as you could, and I mean, you're giving up something to the people who don't need your money.
One thing that that just lit my hair on fire in this book was all the statistics that you talked about. I want to start first with when things were good in the United States. You said, I don't know, I guess this is in the 50s and 60s when post-war, when the tax rate for the wealthy was 70%, right?
Yeah, and in some cases into the 90s.
Okay,
so high enough up there. Yeah.
So talk about that, and talk about how the statistics as we go along to where we are now.
These are years where the American economy is growing, where productivity gains for companies, executives are doing well, ordinary workers are doing well too. Labor unions still represent large numbers of people. And these are positive years. I mean, I don't want a time machine back to the 50s and 60s. We made a lot of social progress that we want to hang on to.
Yeah.
We had Jim Crow in that era.
Yeah.
We had the Vietnam War. But in one regard, we do need to get back, and that's to an economic system where the gains for corporate America are translating into higher wages for everyone. And we had that. And what we have now, through a systematic but very gradual, downgrading of tax rates, a dropping of tax rates for the wealthiest people, and all sorts of new loopholes. Like Schwarzman benefits from this so-called carried interest loophole that allows him to treat his income not as income per se, but as a partnership. It's the result of a partnership, so the tax rates are like half what ordinary people pay. They're lower even than capital gains paid by upper middle class Americans who are lucky enough to have stock portfolios. Net effect of all this is that You now have a situation where people like Jeff Bezos, Steve Schwarzman, Larry Fink are paying a smaller share of their income and wealth to the federal government than the people who are scrubbing their toilets.
It's just shocking. And the thing is their companies are enjoying the infrastructure that is
Right.
paid for by the taxpayer. I mean,
Right.
there's just something so, and when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about the roads, that
Sure.
all that stuff costs a lot of money. And meanwhile, wages, as they make huge returns, their returns are dependent upon them not paying taxes, them not paying living wages, them having access to a global labor pool that is in some countries. I mean, it's just absolutely medieval, and the wages are terrible. So this is a huge problem because globalization. Well, remember NAFTA, that was passed under Clinton, and
Right.
all a lot of stuff went to Mexico because you could hire people for so much cheaper. And people will say, "Wow, that's business. That's what." But in the end, you talk about I'll talk about what the world looks like now that this, go wherever you don't have to pay taxes, all these loopholes that have been created, even here in the United States, by our own presidents. I mean, we forgot to talk about Trump lowering the tax rate again for the wealthy. You know,
Massive tax cut. But let's look even more recently. I mean, we're now living in a time of a horrible war in Ukraine, where we are told the key to stopping this massacre. I mean, it's a humanitarian disaster. Our hearts go out to people in Ukraine. The key to stopping it, we're told, is to hurt the oligarchs. That's a term that we only use, for Russians. We don't use it for our own people. We got to hurt the oligarchs, and if we do that, if we seize their yachts, if we find their ill-gotten gains inside the American and British financial systems, if we grab their empty apartments in posh parts of London and Manhattan, well, we'll inspire them to lash out at Putin, and that will put pressure on him to relent on this war. Well, the truth is that our own oligarchs, Davos Man, their interests have to be taken on as well, because anybody who's worked at the Treasury will tell you it's not so easy to figure out who owns what in the American financial system. There's very little disclosure. And that, again, is not by accident. That's because of the careful lobbying of the financial services industry and private equity and hedge funds. I mean, this is the province of Steve Schwarzman. They're left out of even the current proposals in Congress to increase transparency. So basically, for us to take on the oligarchs who are supporting Putin means we've got to take on Steve Schwarzman and Larry Fink and Jamie Dimon and the other financiers who have lobbied to keep our own financial system opaque.
my question is this situation so big that it can't be remedied? And I ask that, as I'm asking you that question, just keep that question
Yeah.
in mind for a minute. I remember when I was working at CBS and I was reading all these statistics about wages stagnating, wages actually going down with respect to, and I pitched a show. I was working at CBS's in their doc unit,
Yeah.
and I pitched a show, the third worldization of the United States. How labor was, unions were being
Right.
broken up, people were getting less pay, fewer social services, whatever. And I'll never forget, I gave it to a senior producer to look at, and he indeed did the documentary, but he called it, and this is when I was thinking about this Davos Man turnaround: who's getting rich and why aren't you? Okay? As if you're not getting rich was, and this is one of, you mentioned how Bezos had said something to this effect that, if I'm smarter and I'm more energetic and I come up with this, I have a
Right.
right to have all this. But, with a complete willful blindness to, well, you have all this because you exploit a lot of labor.
Right.
You don't pay your taxes, even though you use the infrastructure of all these countries.
I want to be careful to note that my book does not demonize wealthy people. That may sound like a surprise to some
No,
partners.
no, no, no. Yes, and
I
that's
don't
important to
demonize
say.
Bezos. Thank you, Jeff Bezos, for
Exactly.
revolutionizing e-commerce. What a brilliant idea.
Everybody
What a
loves Amazon, let's
fantastically,
face it.
I mean, it's how would we have gotten through the pandemic, right?
Exactly.
Without e-commerce.
Exactly.
And I'm willing to say, I don't know how much Jeff Bezos should live comfortably. We live in a capitalist society. He's made a fortune. A lot people really like shopping at Amazon, and he should be entitled to the rewards of that. He should also pay his taxes. He should also not lobby against paid sick leave. We should have a system where people have health care and they don't have to choose between putting their lives on the line to support their families.
Well, and their health care should not be a business proposition where what kind of health care they get, including the drugs they're offered, including the kind of
Right.
physicians. I mean, as you said, general practitioners have been basically are being taken out of, there are fewer and fewer
Right.
of them because the specialists are the thing, and that is, that's a huge concern. So when you have bottom line considerations like healthcare, housing, that, and now people are saying, oh, it's when in the Great Reset, Klaus says things like, you're not going to own anything and you're going to be happy. It's like, excuse me, what's
Yeah.
this about?
So you ask, are these problems too big to solve? I mean, if we conclude that, we've done a tremendous favor to Davos Man, because as I note in the book, I mean, this kind of cynicism actually works in Davos Man's favor, right? Like the easiest way to sound sophisticated, if you're talking about economics in our current time, is, oh, everything's so complicated. Global flows of money,
Oh,
they're so vast.
yeah.
Technology's changing everything. Automation is a threat to workforce. Don't talk about trade agreements. Don't talk about low wage workers being played off against high wage workers. Well, this is part of this false binary that Davos Man has foisted upon us as a way of preventing us from actually exercising basic democratic rights. So we're supposed to conclude that, well, we either have the world as we know it, where we have COVID vaccines and we have Uber and Google and central air conditioning, and it's all very convenient, and we'll have electric cars. We have all that, but we also have inequality, and we have winner-take-all markets where people like, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are worth, $200 billion. Or we can monkey around with that, and then the alternative is we'll be Venezuela, and we'll be, diving into dumpsters for our dinner, and we won't have any health care at all. Well, that's nonsense. And history tells us that we need to conclude that that's nonsense, because we've been here before. We in the U.S. we had the robber barons in the last century, and that turned into a reaction that led to the trusts getting broken up. We had the Great Depression, which turned into the Social Security system and other New Deal programs that expanded access to health care, that gave us unemployment benefits and things like Medicare and eventually Medicaid. And the result of that was that period that we were talking about earlier, where wasn't perfect. There were all sorts of problems, some of which we've overcome, social problems. But we did have a situation where the old cliche that a rising tide lifts all boats, that really happened. And every community.
It worked. It worked.
And it
Yeah.
turns out that if you boost social safety nets and you give people greater security on healthcare and housing, we'll actually get more of the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that Davos Man loves to celebrate when he's using it to denigrate government and argue for lower taxes. We will actually be more entrepreneurial, not less. if, a person's stuck in a dead-end job or they don't enjoy their work, they don't see any future, but they're terrified to leave because at least it's providing healthcare for their family, they might go out and start a startup company and employ more people and give us a more vibrant, more enjoyable economy. But because we're all slaves to, the status quo, because we understand that change is perilous and, we could lose our healthcare, we're kind of stuck in this moment. Moreover, if nobody's sacrificing, how do we solve problems like climate change?
There's a difference between the other situations and what you're talking about now, because now it's planetary. The warping of the system, right. the warping of the laws, everything, and Davos Man himself, in the end, if he is true to his nature, is, eventually if all the ants are gone, then Davos Man is going to start fighting. They're going to start fighting each other for supremacy. I don't know. That's the way I see it. I see it as kind of almost like a zero-sum game in which, and the population. Another thing that really concerns me is things coming out of the World Economic Forum about population control. I mean, I don't know if you've heard Yuval Harari talking, but that's terrifying to me. And so my question is, if there are legions around the planet of, first of all, world leaders, okay? I mean, you're talking about Macron, and it's interesting that you were discussing, I mean, Macron is a Rothschild guy, and he's a Davos man, and he's done the same things that Trump did, lowered the taxes, the tax rate for the rich, and so on. And of course, he's reviled, and guess who? Zemmour, have you heard Zemmour? He's very right-wing, he's very populist, he's sort of the same. So around the world, things are very similar. Things are happening. So my question to you, and in our government, I mean, the handmaidens, clearly our last three presidents were handmaidens, and it's so easy to buy people off. It's so easy to do that in our Congress. Forget it. Right. So how do you? And I know that you came up with these taxing. Yes, of course, taxing. Right. But how do we get that to happen? Trump, he lowered the taxation when when our deficit is already humongous, Right. So I'm asking you, realistically, because you talked about universal income, you talked about, what were the other things that you talked about? Yeah, cool, whatever, and my question is,
antitrust enforcement.
Antitrust enforcement. Wow, that's a huge one.
That's actually happening, though. That's where we can be most hopeful. I mean, the Federal Trade Commission is now run by this young woman, Lena Khan, who's pioneered a whole new way. Well, in some ways, it's a return to the old way, but it replaces the way of antitrust that we've been living through for 40 years, where so long as consumer prices don't go up, then any merger is good and government should get out of the way and let it happen, never mind predatory prices. I mean, how does that apply in a time where companies like Facebook and Google, they don't charge anything for their products? We're the product, right? They're just harvesting.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And so she's really updated antitrust thinking, and the FTC that's operative today is very serious about taking on the likes of Amazon and Facebook and Google, and that's potentially part of the solution to restoring greater opportunity for more people.
It just seems to me like every time there's a come to Jesus moment in Congress for Facebook and all, Amazon and those guys, it's just theater, and you can almost sense the sense of powerlessness that these senators feel in front of these guys. And I really think, I personally, and I don't know when or how a leader will emerge to become president and to have an administration that would do this, but I think that some of this monopolistic behavior, some of this crushing of labor unions, some of this, giving people wages that don't allow them to live. I mean, Walmart employees have to go on welfare. So we have to, the taxpayer even subsidizes Walmart, for goodness sake,
Oh, for sure.
Somehow the Davos Man stuff has got to be considered criminal.
Well,
Because look at how many people through these various incidents, okay, and the the attack on governments, except to raid the money that is given to those governments by taxpayers, and the co-opted leaders who then help out Davos Man and throw everybody else under the bus. Somehow, some of that has to be criminalized so that they don't have, the incentive is not there to not pay taxes, or to not, there has to be some kind of accountability for this devastation.
There definitely has to be accountability. And I get the rage for those who are paying attention and digging into these issues, and I feel it too. But I think we've got to remember that we don't need a revolution. We don't need a utopian fantasy. We don't need extremism. What we need is things we've already had. I mean, if we had progressive taxation and antitrust enforcement.
But how are you going to get that?
Well, no, that's the key question. And that is the hardest question. And there is no question that Davos Man is not going to unilaterally disarm. Davos Man's got this incredible apparatus that's built to perpetuate the status quo. And the most I can tell you is it starts with disabusing ourselves of this absurd notion that we can just count on the billionaire class to solve our problems. Because, that's what stakeholder capitalism is really about. It's about saturating our discourse with this idea that, we don't need government. Therefore, we don't need taxes. I mean, in fact, Mark Benioff is the fifth character we haven't talked about yet. He's the CEO of Salesforce, the Silicon Valley tech company. He literally said at Davos last year, he said, this is virtual Davos, they couldn't meet in person, CEOs are the real heroes of the pandemic. I mean, think about it. He wasn't talking about frontline medical workers. He wasn't talking about parents stuck at home dealing with kids, contending with distance learning. He wasn't talking about people delivering packages, processing our food, emptying bedpans in hospitals and senior citizens. No, CEOs, he said, are the real heroes of the pandemic. And he said, they gave us credit that staved off bankruptcy, and they gave us COVID vaccines. Never mind that, we're subsidizing the monopoly royalties of pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, whose CEO, Bourla, also signed the stakeholder capitalism pledge, selling their vaccines at whatever price they can get around the world. And
again, given away by our government. Again.
And again, not by accident, right? So Benioff says, and the government didn't save you, non-governmental organizations didn't save you. We saved you, not for profit, but to save the world. That's where, to answer your question, it's got to start. It's not a satisfying answer. It's only a partial answer. We've got to stop falling for this kind of thinking. We've got to understand that this is self-serving framing that is designed to make us relax, and very supposedly professional, sophisticated, business journalists will say, oh, the CEOs get it now. They understand inequality, populism, they've got to do better than they've done. And we've got to get back to letting businesses run themselves as businesses. They are going to maximize profit for shareholders. We are living in Milton Friedmanism. Let's just be honest about that. And then we've got to do our jobs in using our democracies to actually have a say about how the winnings are distributed. And that is going to be very hard. I'm not pretending otherwise. You have to get the money out of politics.
These Davos people, they're hungry ghosts. They can never get enough. It's never, ever, ever enough. Even though after you've had a few billion, I mean, the rest is just, I don't know what it is, but it's, anyway. So they're hungry ghosts, and they're always going to fight to maintain their ability to continue to gather even more. That environment that they're creating out there is going to come closer and closer and closer to them too. And then where do they go? I mean, they can keep moving around the globe and so on, but in the end,
I think they're doing okay.
Yeah,
I wouldn't weep for the billionaire class. I mean,
I think you're misunderstanding what I'm saying here. What I'm trying to say is they will go that far. They will go that far. In Haiti, They laid waste to the whole damn country as they kept making money, and then they just moved to Miami, and they're still making money down there. What's left to be made?
I
you
completely
know?
agree with you. I mean, Benioff said in something like April of 2020, he went on Jim Cramer's show, Mad Money. That's his favorite show to go on, and he said, the one good thing about the pandemic is like it's unified us all. Like we're all uniquely, we're all, communally vulnerable to the same virus. And he specifically said it's a race to the illusions of our borders. I repeated that somewhere the other day, and then I heard from a Salesforce employee who let me know that Salesforce actually does a lot of business with Homeland Security, an institution for whom the borders are in no way illusory. But of course, Benioff's saying this. He's sitting in his $28 million mansion overlooking San Francisco Bay, or his place on the Big Island of Hawaii. He's tweeting out pictures of himself on his boat with Lars Ulrich, the drummer from Metallica. He's traveling around the South Pacific on private jets and yachts. And it's very clear that this virus has in no way hit us equally. And that, to your point, there are some people who are extremely vulnerable, while Davos Man is in some cases literally going into space. And yeah, I share your concern, and apologies if I misconstrued what you were saying earlier. I mean, I don't think the fact that the environment is getting less and less hospitable to most of us will somehow be a break on the status quo for Davos Man, because Davos Man has ways to cushion himself against all of these.
Infinite ways. And my only concern at this point is if Davos Man feels threatened by angry populations all around the world, what he will be motivated to do, what he will be motivated to invest in and use against the global population, because he's able to do it. I don't think they say Davos Man. I think Davos Man is amoral, and I think Davos Man looks at people like you and me and even lesser folks as sort of, we can be useful cockroaches, or we can just be cockroaches,
Right.
And so the question is how do the cockroaches become humans again? That's my question. And I think we have to be very, just to say, we have to tax Davos Man. Well, he's got the system sewn up. So how do we get him to do that?
Well, again,
meanwhile, he's eating into our education, right. Making housing impossible, making good health care impossible, and our environment.
The reason to be unhappy, to throw our hands in the air, it would be easy to do that. There are lots of reasons to conclude that this is impossible, except for the fact that we've been here before. And
not on a global level. Powerful. Not on a global level, we have not been here before. And that's the difference. And that's a huge difference. But I will say this, and that's why I read your book cover to cover, because I think this is the first book that really, and you're a good writer too, which is great. You're a wonderful writer. So it's easy to read. All of you who don't want to pick up a book, this is a very easy book to read. And if you really, really want to understand what's going on, Davos Man is the book to read. I think this is a good start for defining the situation. And if you can look at the situation squarely in the eye, then you can start thinking about how to address it.
Right.